Hi, I'm Tristan, and this is Thinking About Politics. So today, we're asking a simple-sounding question, and it's this. Should church and state be separate? We're going to do a bit of a thought experiment, I suppose. For some folks, this is a no-brainer. Obviously, it should. And for other folks, this is also a no-brainer. Obviously, they shouldn't. We all know that here in the United States, our First Amendment decrees that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And Thomas Jefferson was famous for saying that there would be a wall of separation between church and state. And there are some folks who don't agree. We thought we'd really sit down and think about it logically and play a little thought experiment in our heads to see if we can figure out whether or not church and state should be separate, or whether church and state should be joined, like in a theocracy. To start things off, let's start with arguments for why church and state shouldn't be separate. I'm an amateur historian. I like reading about history. Seems to me that most governments throughout human history have been based on a theology of some kind. A priestly caste or a king put there by divine right. The divine has played a pretty powerful role in the governing of human affairs. You think about this, and it makes a lot of sense, If, and I'm not telling you what to believe here, I'm just saying, let's play a thought experiment. If there is a God or gods, and if those gods or God take an interest in human affairs such that they're willing to mess with us if we do things wrong, and if there exist special people who can talk to God or the gods, who can represent them here on earth, who can divine their will and pull out of the mystery of existence what the gods or the God wants us to do, well, great. You'd be silly not to follow that guy's advice, right? There's some starry dynamo in the sky that's ready to strike you down if you step out of line. You better listen to the guy who knows where the line is. That makes sense. So, I guess we're done. Church and state should not be separate, right? Well, hold on. An issue that also crops up in human governments is this. Different people praying to different gods. Remember those special people who talk to the God or the gods? A lot of times, they don't really agree on what's going on. So the problem is this. If there's a God that's infallible, and then there are special people who talk to God or the gods, and those special people are now telling us different things, we've got to figure out a way to resolve that. One God says, hey, do one thing, and another God says, hey, do the other thing. Or, even worse, what if the special people say that they're speaking for the same God? Now you're really in trouble. So, as human beings, we have a very practical problem. Assuming there is a God or gods, and assuming that they take an interest in human affairs, and assuming there are people who can talk to that God or gods, how do we resolve the conflict between different people? How do we separate people who are genuinely talking to that God or gods from people who are just making it up? Serious problem. But now, let's say you've solved that problem. You've worked out a priestly caste that's going to talk to God for you. You've worked out your political system so that your country is now in line with the big guy. What about all those other countries that are flying in the face of God's will? What if your God wants you to do something about those infidels as well? Well, you'd be silly not to take that order if God's telling you to do it, right? So you can see how, assuming there is a God or gods, assuming that they take an interest in human affairs, and assuming that there are special human beings who can talk to gods or figure out the holy will, it's a recipe for conflict. You will never end in conflict. Human beings don't just believe all the same thing, they believe many, many, many different things. I mean, this seems like a recipe for never-ending war. And it was. We forget in the United States that theocracy, again, was the norm in Europe and even in places like Massachusetts. Theocracy was used to kill people, to keep society from advancing, and ultimately resulted in the mistreatment of many, many folks. Finally, in the 17th century, there was what was called the 30 Years' War. Now, the 30 Years' War was a religious war. It was a religious sectarian conflict between different types of Christians. People who believed in the same God, but believed that God was speaking to them differently, believed that the divine will was different. And it resulted in the most destructive and bloody conflict in European history until the First World War. Maybe the Napoleonic Wars, I don't really know. But it was a big flippin' deal. When human societies take their marching order from a god or gods, it's going to result in conflict, and that's a practical problem. As a religious matter, it's not. Because if God is God, and God is telling you to kill all the infidels, well then, by Jove, you better go and kill all the infidels. But maybe, just maybe, you're not really talking to God. So, I mean, the only out I can see is if God would move the hearts of man such that we would all believe in concert together, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. So again, assuming there is a God, assuming people can talk to God, assuming God is taking a very active interest in human affairs, you can make that argument for theocracy, but it is a recipe for nonstop conflict. What's the argument against church and state? Well, the argument against it is that conflict. It's all well and good to say that you have the capital T truth, and you know what to do with it. But the problem is that when different special people praying to different gods or the same gods come away with different divine instructions, it really puts us in a bind. We got to figure out, we are still stuck in a situation where human beings have to deal with other human beings to work out what's going on. See, the separation of church and state is not the default of human beings. It's a thing that developed. And it developed because of the forever war I just described. A non-stop conflict. Over and over and over again because you think God is telling you to do it. And why do you think God is telling you to do it? Well, because there's some special person who can talk to God and is telling you that's the marching orders. Or even worse, you think God's giving you those marching orders itself. When there is no separation of church and state, the individual has zero freedom to disagree with that special person. Because that special person is no longer a person. They're God's avatar on earth. They have left the realm of free and equal human beings and now are claiming to be something else. Me, as just some guy, I better follow that special person or I'm going to find myself burned at the frickin' stake or something like that. It's not conducive to individuality. It's not conducive to social development. And ultimately, even if that special person is talking to the actual real bona fide God, unless there's a way for me to figure that out, it is just oppression from where I sit. Subjectively. I may be sinning against God. I don't know. But neither do you. I promise you. And all of those special people, well, they all can't be right, can they? Now, there's a serious issue with taking your orders from special people who talk to God. They are people. They aren't gods. They aren't holy. They aren't better than anybody else. They're subject to the same frailties and weaknesses as any other human being. They are equal to all of us. No better, no worse. Assuming that there is a God sitting on high, assuming that that God or gods do want to take an active interest in human affairs, and assuming that they do talk to people every now and again, the vast majority of people who are talking have either messed up the message or they aren't talking to God. There's no way they can all be correct, right? As a factual matter. So who gets to decide? Who gets to decide? In the past, the decision was made through war. The stronger side could just beat you into submission. That's not really a great solution. Who would argue that the last 300 years have not been a marked improvement over the previous 3,000? In terms of human quality of life, the capacity for human freedom, ideas about equality, material culture, technology. We've gone to the frickin' moon, for Christ's sakes. And another thing we've learned is that those nonconformists, the people most primed not to listen to the special people, those are the folks you need in your society. Those are the folks who are going to challenge you. Those are the folks who are going to push you. Those are the people who are going to make the world a better place for tomorrow. Without deviation from the norm, progress is not possible. That might be a Frank Zappa quote. I don't know. So I hope you can see why something like separation of church and state is so important to a country like the United States, where we recognize the equality of every individual. we recognize that every person is allowed to take their destiny into their own hands and is able to look into their own conscience and decide whether and which special people they're going to listen to, and they can decide whether and which gods maybe are talking to them directly. And the knock-on result is that we don't have to kill each other over religion. Because what I do with my religious life is not a matter of life and death for you. And what you do in your religious life, it's not a matter of life and death for me. And it has been a matter of life and death for so many generations of humans. And we in this spoiled modern age forget. Especially you right-wing American Christians. You guys gotta chill, okay? You don't know what you're asking for if you're asking for theocracy. So let me know what you all think in the comments below. Separation of church and state is at the bedrock of the American experience. And it's clear that there are and there have always been segments of the American population that have not wanted separation of church and state, that have wanted a theocracy. And there have been places in this country where we've essentially had theocracies, like in Massachusetts, where people were hung for not praying to the state religion, where people were exiled for not praying the right way and for challenging local authorities. Is that really the kind of world you want? Is that what freedom and equality means to you? Anyway, that's all from me. You've been great. I hope to see you next time, but until then,
I ain't got time to kiss you now. I'm busy with this mule.